Aloha, everyone. I am so excited to be hosting this panel today where we are getting the opportunity to speak with Pacific Islander authors of fantasy, science fiction, horror, and speculative fiction in general on their process for world building, where they will share their experiences and advice. I'm happy to introduce today's panel. We have Malia Maunakea, Gina Cole, Cassie Hart, and myself, Shay Kauwe. I'm going to hand it off to Malia so that she can introduce herself and her book.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Malia Maunakea. I'm a Hapa Hawaiian author of middle grade, which means books for readers 8 and up, and hopefully in the future YA, which are books for 12 and up, mostly contemporary fantasy. My family is from Puna on Hawaii Island and Maili on Oahu. My debut middle grade novel, Lay in the Fire Goddess, came out last summer. And it's about a girl on an adventure to rescue her best friend who's been kidnapped by the fire goddess Pele. It's perfect for fans of Percy Jackson and Disney's Moana.
Thank you so much, Malia. Next, I will be handing it off to Gina Cole.
Kena koutou katoa, ni Sambulivanaka malo lele. My name is Gina Cole. I am Fijian from the island of Onoi, Lao, and the Lao group. And I'm part of the Pasifika diaspora, born and raised in New Zealand, Aotearoa. I write mainly fiction and short stories, and I have a short story collection called Black Ice Matter, which was published in 2016, and my science fiction fantasy novel Na Viro was published in 2022 in a genre which I call Pasifikafuturism. So Na Viro was a story about a young Fijian, Tongan, Majoran woman who flies into space to save her sister from a whirlpool.
Thank you so much, Gina. And we have Cassie Hart, so I will hand it off to her.
Kia ora, I'm Cassie. I'm a kaitahu author from Ngā Mutu Taranaki. I write a range of horror and speculative fiction, and my award-winning novel Butcherbird came out in 2021. It's a supernatural thriller set in rural Taranaki, where Gina returns to her family home to uncover the truth around the fire that killed her family, and long-buried secrets come back to bite.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your work and a little bit of what you do. And for people who are watching at home, my name is Shay Kauwe. I am today's host. I'm also a Hapa Hawaiian author of fantasy and other speculative fiction. I hail from Waimanalo on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And my upcoming book is entitled In Language There Is Death. It is an urban fantasy about a world where every language is its own branch of magic, and an unlicensed spellsmith must defend her community from the rapidly expanding city of Los Angeles, set to release in spring 2025. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm really excited to get us kicked off and jump into some of the questions that we have, which were submitted by various people, and also just which I think would be a really good dive into your different works, because we have a wide breadth of kind of stories here. I'm going to start with a few general questions. If it's all right, I'll kind of call your name just so we don't overlap on each other, because this is a virtual meeting for today. And feel free to stop me at any point. So yeah, I was hoping to start with Gina. I know that your latest book is science fiction. Like you mentioned, you had a specific word for it, Pasifikafuturism. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Can you explain a little bit about what your world building process looks like? Like, how do you start an idea and then build upon it?
Okay, so Na Viro was written in a genre I call Pasifikafuturism, which is basically science fiction fantasy written by Pasifika writers, featuring Pacific characters and Pacific culture, and aimed at a Pacific audience and anyone else who's interested in science fiction from a Pacific Ocean point of view. So my world building process for Na Viro was centered around trying to represent these elements of Pacific indigeneity. And so my ideas come from my culture and what I think that might look like in a futuristic setting. So for example, one of the indigenous Pacific practices I incorporated into my writing was the art of waka building, or ocean-going canoes. And also allied to that was the art of celestial navigation or wayfinding, which is how my ancestors navigated across the sea using everything around them in the Pacific environment. And so I also used the concept of the Pacific concept of the va, which is basically this. It means the space between, and it can be the space between two people, or the space between two islands, or the space between two planets. And it's not empty space. It is a space of connection that needs to be cared for and nurtured. And I think this is kind of a common concept in the Pacific, this kind of concept of being interconnected. And also the concept that the Pacific is a sea of islands, meaning we are all connected again. And so I researched these sorts of concepts and took them up into a space, into a sky of islands, or a galaxy of islands, or a universe of islands.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just as like a follow-up question, I'm curious, like, what inspired you to write in this specific genre, right? Like the move from traditional practices and then taking it into a science fiction realm. Like, was there any particular moment where you made that connection?
Yeah, well, I am a real science fiction nerd. I grew up in the 1970s watching Star Trek and all the other speculative fiction space stories on TV at the time, like The Land of the Giants and Lost in Space and Doctor Who and I Dream of Jeannie. And I loved science fiction, but I didn't see myself in any of those, represented in any of those, except any of those programs. And the only woman really that I connected with was Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. She was the only black woman anywhere on television in the 1970s that I was aware of, and anywhere in cultural production at that time. And so she made a real impact on me. And I also found that there was very few science fiction novels written by Pacific writers, especially set in space. And so I wanted to change that. And during my PhD, I researched, I discovered Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism. And both Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism include science fiction written by First Nations peoples, whether they're from America or from, in the case of Afrofuturism, written by African American writers. And they inspired me to formulate this genre, which I call Pasifikafuturism. And that's, Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, then you must write it. So I kind of went along that track because I wanted to see Pacific Islanders represented in science fiction set in space. And there was, we weren't.
And it does feel like a natural extension from what you were discussing about wayfinding. Like, it very much is a literal connection between space and a Pacific Islander and our people. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm going to be moving on to Cassie, kind of taking a little pivot here into horror, but still very much world building. I think I'm curious, like, what does your world building process look like? Obviously, I think most people probably wouldn't associate, the Pacific Islands with horror naturally. It tends to exist in like spooky English countrysides, but what kind of brought that idea to light?
I think that is certainly, it's less seen. And I think especially because for people from our culture, like, we have this connection with our land and our place and like this respect for nature and the environment and relationship and those kind of things. So it's maybe not necessarily the most obvious fit, but for me, it was, in part, I was, for Butcherbird in particular, I was writing a love letter to the place I grew up, which was this farm that my grandparents, my grandmother had lived on her whole life. And so it was kind of like I had that connection to the land, and my characters have the same connection to the land. And Taranaki, our mountain, who's such a huge presence in the region that I live in, and other places. And if you've ever seen me talk on a panel about my book, I always talk about Taranaki and how wonderful he is, because he just is. So better throw that in there. But I think for me, because I love horror so much, I grew up reading a lot of horror. My extended family library was full of Stephen King, but also like lots of science fiction and lots of like all the Dune books and all the Terry Pratchett and the Belgariad, and lots of very white fantasy, because that was what you had then. So I grew up, everything was speculative to me, and I spent a lot of time being speculative on my farm, or on the land, my grandparents' farm. So for me, because I love horror so much, I wanted to put that into a book. And I think in particular in New Zealand and other countries where you're an island, there's that sense of isolation, which I wanted to play into. So it's not necessarily a cultural thing, but there's certainly that sense of being apart, like away from other things. So yeah, I think for the world building stuff, it was less about what you might think of in terms of world building, like the specifics of geography or culture or the way things play together, and more about history. So while my main character is not Māori, the second point of view character, he is. So he kind of represents my biracial background and the discomfort of not knowing so well where you come from, and learning things about yourself that you didn't know before. And there's also things about generational trauma, which is very common in our kind of experience. So yeah, so maybe not exactly the way that you might look at world building from other angles, but that's how it kind of worked together for me.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I definitely feel that the sense of place is something that you can find in all of the books that we have here. Yeah. Definitely. I know, like Malia, for example, your book is set in Big Island very heavily, where your family is from. And Gina, though your stories take place in, this fictionalized world, it very much is rooted in your own experience and the own places and cultural practices you have. I kind of want to draw on this idea about this discomfort of not knowing, because I feel like it leads into Malia's book a little bit more, specifically your main character, who I think, interestingly enough, though it is a middle grade story, has a lot of the same feelings and experiences that Cassie just described. But I love how you weaved in these magical elements into your story, Malia, because, I feel like that was a lot of this character's journey and understanding they are. So I'm just kind of curious, also because you're the only person I think who was very strictly fantasy, how you went about building this magic system. And, that's a big job to take these cultural elements and create your own magical world. So how did that work out for you, if you don't mind me asking?
It's scary when you're combining something that is so culturally kind of sacred or passed down for so many generations to think about altering it in any way. So by introducing characters that hadn't really been in our oral histories before, I tried to give myself an opening, or give myself that flexibility to create that magic system. It is kind of playing off of, I don't want to give spoilers, but it is kind of playing off of our stories a bit. But I never heard any stories about how exactly those creatures in our genealogy work with us. It's always been sort of vague to me. So I hoped that by creating this story and my interpretation of how these creatures interact with their families, it would be okay, because I'm not messing with the big ones. I'm not messing with the gods. I'm not messing with the people people who have been in legends and lore forever. I introduce newer characters that are not in any of the stories that I can manipulate and shift and change.
I think I'd like to kind of pose this question, since it's come up naturally to the group, about, do writers have a responsibility to represent their cultures accurately when they're drawing on their own cultures and their worlds and ideas? Like, all of us obviously take elements of that. I know, Cassie, for example, in your book, there is mention of bones, which, anybody from a Pacific Islander culture can tell you, like, that is a very sensitive topic, something that's core, as well as in Gina's story, right? The idea of wayfinding, but pulling it into this uber scientific world where if I'm not mistaken, there was, like, I remember in one particular part about traditional and modern were kind of blended together in how they both mapped out the world, and also in the creation of things like sails or communication devices. So, like, where is that line for you folks when we're writing these kinds of stories that are, I know, sorry, that's like a very big question. But yeah.
I think it is a big question, but I think I think sometimes the line is not like a hard line that everyone has to follow, but it's the line of where you're comfortable. And sometimes, like I was saying to someone earlier about how, even though New Zealand is very small, different tribes have different versions of the stories. There are very commonalities in the stories that we have, but there's so many different ways of looking at them, or ways that they're told or retold. And I think sometimes when we've been disconnected from our culture by force in a lot of ways, through governing systems, and we have to try and piece together, it's almost a process of like pulling together the threads of what we can find and weaving our own way into our culture. So in some ways, I can't see it as a hard line, because it's like what is known, but also what is relevant to my iwi or someone else's iwi. Like, you want to be respectful, but you have to find new ways to connect with the old. And I think that's part of our job, is to try and do that in a way that is respectful, but allows us to kind of weave our own magic with our histories and our culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I liked what you said, Cassie, about the fact that the oral history isn't perfect. Like, a lot of the stories that I've been researching do have conflicting details, or do have major discrepancies from one island to the next, or even within districts. So I think, just like you said, we're not retelling history. We're not nonfiction writers. We are fiction, fantasy, whatever writers, and that gives us a little bit of grace in what we're doing, as long as we're able to explain and show where the truth ends and the story begins a little bit.
Yeah, and where our truth begins as well. Because it's like just kind of the acknowledgement of, like, this is the way I'm envisaging it. This is not the way that other people would. I found out just a couple of weeks ago that because Taranaki's always been male to me, but I found out actually around the coast, like further around the mountain, they consider him to be female. And I'm like, I didn't even know that. I've lived here most of my life, and it's like, even within the same region, like I was like, oh, I'd never known it ever said that to me until someone did say it to me. So it's like, well, for me, he's been male my whole life, and for this other person, she's been female, and it's different. Yeah, it's like, that's my truth, that's their truth, and that's okay. They can both exist. They can coexist at the same time, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think in the Pacific, we can't get past our history of colonization and what has been lost, and how we are trying to often retrieve a lot of information that has been lost in that process. And I think in writing science fiction, I'm trying to imagine Pacific peoples living in the future, and there's a fantasy spin on it. So I do research Pacific culture and then try and take it into a future setting. But like you say, Malia, that the stories often are a bit broken sometimes because of the impact of rampant colonization and predatory capitalism and militarism and all of these impacts on our culture. And I think that just representing our culture at all in the future is a good thing. And I also think that our culture doesn't remain static. Culture evolves. So I think there's a certain amount of license, as I think someone was saying, especially when writing science fiction or fantasy, to represent our culture in an evolved state. We can have that license to do that. But I think there are some things that always remain the same. I think in those situations, I think there is I feel some kind of responsibility to get it right. And I think those are principles and values that remain as the same and endure over time, like, the importance of family and principles of reciprocity and manaakitanga, and which is looking after each other, and kaitiakitanga or stewardship or kotahitanga or unity. These kind of baseline principles and values that we have, I think we can embed them in a science fiction or fantasy story, and then kind of expand out and make, I don't know, waka made out of rainbow or something. I don't know. Yeah, but I think there are some our values endure over time.
Yeah, I would agree with that one.
Yeah, I love that. It's speaking of, like you said, colonization touches all of us. I'm reminded of the quote from Queen Liliuokalani. I'm definitely not going to say this exactly right, so please forgive me. But you mentioned like the way to lose a kingdom was to be inflexible and intolerant, but another was to be too flexible and too tolerant of many wrongs, and that it was, a very, very thin line, like the width of a blade of peely grass. And I think that kind of expertly sums up, although different contexts, very much what we do as writers, which is to balance both. Because why I think, for example, Gina, your expression of like connecting Pacificafuturism to Afrofuturism is this idea that I think a lot of times as Indigenous people, we're framed as wanting to go back. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that a lot of our writing is actually about moving forward and how to make progress with these things that have happened to us. They're facts, colonization and the destruction of language, for example, or losing our culture, becoming diaspora. So how do we're trying to like put these together? What now is really what I find as a similar theme in all of our books.
I think that's one of the beautiful things about speculative fiction is you are imagining worlds where things are different, and that's the power of it, because we can do it in a way that you can't do it with straight contemporary fiction or historical fiction, as we can imagine how it would be.
Yeah.
I think that this sort of speculative fiction provides the ability to imagine new futures and get away from the current reality of science fiction, for instance, which is a genre that's dominated by a white male, middle class, cisgendered, heterosexual point of view. And we can, I don't know, but colonization kind of is kind of post-apocalyptic, which places us directly in the narrative found in science fiction for me, that we are living in apocalyptic dystopia because of the effects of colonization. So yeah, I think we can imagine different futures where we survive and thrive.
Yeah, I love that. So kind of speaking of this idea of historical fiction and even like contemporary fiction, realistic fiction, would you say that if you're writing something that is fantasy or science fiction or speculative, how much do you let the premise of your story, or even just the story in general, take you away from these realistic or historical depictions? And would you say there are any risks in doing so?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
I guess I don't write many things from historical. So.
I know. I was like, I also don't write historical fiction, but
but our history has a way of impacting our present and our future, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think in what I've done already, I didn't veer very far because I was afraid to. On the first couple, I didn't want to upset anybody. I tried to stick as close to the stories as I learned them within this brand new story. But on this, I'm working on a third middle grade, just writing a new story, and I'm giving myself permission to veer much farther by setting it on an imaginary island instead of putting it in Hawaii. And I've found that loosens it up a lot and allows me to strike a balance that's way more on the fantasy side than on the realism side that I had been towing that line in my first couple books. So I'm not sure for me if it's possible to continue writing stories that are like a contemporary fantasy set in a very realistic place on an existing island and veering from the truth as much as I would want. I think it's easier to separate it, create a new place, and then have at it and create my own world in that way.
Definitely makes it easier.
I had that same issue when I was starting to write my second book, which I'm working on now. And I have those same sorts of thoughts. So I've set it in a parallel universe, which is parallel to our universe. So there are some, I have given myself that license, like you say, to veer off and not upset anybody, because there are some similarities to this world, but it's a different world altogether. So I kind of got around it that way, because
I think in some ways, sorry, you finish.
Yeah, I just feel that kind of difficulty with trying to represent the world that I'm living in, and I don't want to overstep. So I thought that was a good way to around it.
Definitely. It also allows you to kind of pick and choose which elements of our world you want to explore, which can line up with the themes of your story or the story you want to tell. So it does give you more freedom to kind of, like you were saying, tell the story that you want to tell. I had another thought and it disappeared, but I'm not sure if it's going to come back or not. So that's okay. My brain does
that. Is totally okay. Don't worry. It happens all the time. I'm actually going to go against the grain here. I think that it is important to represent cultures accurately, but I also think something Cassie mentioned, like our own experiences are so unique, and that does shade how we view things in a way. But I do think one of those underlying themes of all Pacific Islanders, of all Indigenous people, is storytelling itself. It's such a huge thing that I think that, why do we have different versions of the same tale? I think that often it's because it's at the discretion, and we sometimes need to trust ourselves with taking those creative liberties, because ultimately, at least my personal feelings as a writer is, I feel that if I ever go too far, somebody will definitely let me know. And I will be admonished. We'll get that pull back in, and then we can move from there. But yeah.
Yeah, I think as people writing things that are, firstly, I think that there's no way to avoid writing our culture because it's who we are, and that's going to find its way into the story, whether it has any bearing on our Indigenous cultures or not. Like, you know, we could be writing something that's pure fantasy, not related to our cultures, but it will still have elements of our cultures in there because that's just who we are. So I think it's hard, it's impossible not to write something, even as if you're writing as far away from it as possible. But I also think that, it's important to kind of think about the fact that other people, white people, have no problems writing about our culture any way that they want to. And so sometimes we need to take that power back by writing about our cultures in the way that we want to write about our cultures. The number of times I've been on panels or in groups of people where some middle-aged white guy is spouting on about this amazing book he wrote, pitching multiple things from multiple cultures, and I just wanted to claw his eyeballs out, is numerous. Like, it happens all the time, and they just do it with so much confidence, and I don't have that much confidence because I have respect for my culture and I love my whānau, and there's so much respect and so much want and so much shame about not knowing things and so much worry about doing it right or doing it well, that I think that we sometimes need to remind ourselves that we actually have a right to tell these stories in the ways that we're comfortable with, because I think that's really important. Like, I wouldn't write a story that I wasn't comfortable with, because I'd still need to live with it or live with what my family are going to say about it. It's, but we kind of need to remember that other people will quite happily tromp all over our culture and use it any way they want to. And so we have a right to it. And so we should be able to do that if we're comfortable with it in ways that resonate with us and our culture.
Right. Oh yeah, I love that. I feel like there's, like you said, there's elements of your own worldview that come into the writing that if you're not from that culture, you wouldn't even think of to write. Like, you wouldn't even think of to include because it's just not your personal experience. So yeah, I like that a lot. So on that note, I'm going to move us to another important question that was submitted. What are your opinions on, like, working with consultants? Like, should writers consult with experts on elements of their world and world building? For example, meeting with a geologist when forming geography of one's world, or other things like that?
I did. I looked for experts. Like, I wanted to include holua, like sled, and that kind of a race. And I just figured it'd be faster and better if I reached out to somebody who knew it well. And he was awesome. And Tom Pohaku Stone really helped me craft the details of that section well. And I watched a bunch of his videos. And then I called the National Park Service in Volcano and asked them a lot of questions about lava tubes and volcanoes and the geology and all of how things are formed there, and where have you seen these features and all of that. And can you give me plants that happen at different altitudes or elevations? And I did a lot of research because, again, it was my first book and I was scared people were going to destroy it. So that was my way of reassuring myself that I've done the best that I can to create this world as accurately as I want it to be portrayed. I don't think it's a necessary thing by any means, but for me and for my own personal, like, how do I write a story? That consulting with the experts. I also hired a sensitivity reader to help me with all of the language pieces that I have in there, because I don't speak Hawaiian fluently, and that was important. So yes, I leaned heavily on other people and thanked them profusely in acknowledgements.
The beautiful thing is that most experts love sharing their expertise, don't they? Like, they're passionate about it, and they really like it when people ask them about it because they actually get to talk about it freely. But I think that if you've got something and you need more knowledge on it, definitely go consult people. Sensitivity readers are great as well. Yeah, there's so many amazing people in the world who know so many things that we just don't know, and lots of things that you can't even find on the internet readily. So go to the source where you can, like if it's available to you as an option, for sure.
Yeah, I also think it's, you know, not necessary to do it if you don't want to, but I did. I think it helped me give some depth to the writing. I spent some time in the Marshall Islands during the writing of Na Viro, and I met with a master waka builder from Bikini Atoll to give me some ideas about what goes into building a waka, and he was also a wayfinding expert, and I did a lot of research on wayfinding. I did a lot of reading about Indigenous Pacific waka, and I went on a waka ride in the harbour with some wayfinding experts, and that all of that gave me ideas and impressions and inspiration, which fed into my writing. And it gives you, I think it helps you with details, and it just gave me ideas to draw on when I was writing, and just gave that kind of sense of, it gave me confidence that I was writing correctly about these issues and these practices, because I wanted to get it right, but also I enjoyed it immensely, and I learnt heaps when I was doing it. So, you know,
it's kind of like the iceberg thing, right? Like, you know, you learn all this knowledge. It doesn't all necessarily make it into the book, but the fact you know it and you went looking for it kind of builds that depth and richness to a world.
Yeah. Doesn't necessarily make it into the book, like you say, but in some way it influences how you write.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that. Like I had mentioned very briefly in my own book, like my magic system is completely based off of language, and I'm also not a fluent speaker of Hawaiian. So I had to talk to fluent speakers of Hawaiian. Like, of course it makes sense. I do feel like I towed the line by making my main character also not fluent, which, you know, we put our own experiences in the book. But I think the general consensus from this group is yes, absolutely. Like I feel like that that makes sense. Another cultural theme. There's even a Hawaiian, like Olelo no Iao, about it, like Nana Hikumu, right? Look towards the source. I think it's just something that we would probably do naturally, and it can't ever hurt. So why not?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to a couple of fun questions here. I'm interested about what is your favorite detail about the world that you created? So since we're talking about these tiny details, what is something that you really like that maybe the average person might not know if they were just reading your book, but you just thought it was fun?
It's funny because I think I can think of more things that were tiny details that didn't make it into the final book than like you know, like it's like the things you thought of and then you kind of added in, but then you didn't that didn't come out in the wash. I'm trying to think of something. It's a hard one.
I could definitely share something since I'm thinking of it at the moment, and it's about language. Yeah. In my world, like the language has to be accurate in order for it to work, or like the magic doesn't work. And one thing that always trips me up in Hawaiian is pronouns. So like kako versus lako versus olua, that kind of thing. So I specifically included a point where my main character like messes up and it doesn't work because she uses the wrong pronoun. And I love that. It's a detail nobody else is really going to get unless you learn Hawaiian and you know how difficult that is. But it's something that I really love. It's just like a small thing that I know when my people are reading it, they like will get that connection. I hope somebody will chuckle.
I think my world in Na Viro is very watery and oceanic. And so I don't know, I had a taniwha in the whirlpool, and and the guns were wave guns, and the screens were lake screens, and everything is very watery. And I wanted to I had this view of the ocean and space as being mirrors of each other, so that the ocean is a metaphor for space and vice versa. There's a galaxy in the ocean. And so I wanted the spaceships to be sentient entities that would have the same kind of features as fish or sea creatures. And so I modeled the spaceships on whales and jellyfish, and they're able to travel through space like those sea creatures travel through the ocean. So yeah, it's all very kind of ocean-based, water-based kind of detail.
It makes so much sense when you explain it, where I find myself going like, of course, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
The one, when I was trying to figure out what the sidekick would be in the story and digging into Hawaii's animals, I really wanted it to be a mammal because I think mammals are cute, and I already have reptiles and bugs and other stuff. So I wanted a mammal, but I also was working really hard at using native species and endemic and indigenous species. So I went down rabbit holes doing that bit of research, and it turns out Hawaii only has 2 native mammals and only 1 native land mammal. So that is how my sidekick became a bat.
As soon as you said native, I was like the list shrunk very, very quickly. There, I was like, okay, was it monk seal and bat? Because I was like, is that it?
Yep, that's it. The Hawaiian monk seal, and the monk seal was not about to make it up a volcano, so
okay.
The bat it is.
Awesome. Yeah, and the theme of animals then will go with the birds and Butcherbird. And they're magpies, so they're not native. There's a fly on my camera. That's weird. Yeah, it could. In Māori culture, birds are often they give messages. So the birds in my books tend to give messages of one kind or another. So that's they were magpies though, because if you've lived in rural New Zealand, you know all about the magpies. So they tend to be quite protective of their spaces and scare away anyone who's there when they shouldn't be there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so another fun question. When you are reading other novels that have world building, do you have any pet peeves? Or even in your own novel, like something that you really dislike. I will again start with an example because I've got one ready to go. I really dislike in world building when something is clearly set in the past, but they use modern slang. That drives me absolutely nuts. I cannot handle it. I don't like it at all. It's just a pet peeve though.
I don't want to read pages and pages of info dumping about how the world works. I just really want to be immersed in the world through what's happening to the characters. And I did that. I wrote pages and pages and pages of how the world works, and then I had to cut it. Focus on the characters and rather than focus on the world, and focus on how the characters operate in the world, so that the world is a natural part of the narrative.
Yeah,
but
that was going to be my one.
Pardon?
It annoys me. That was going to be my one too. It annoys me so much. Like, the characters show up in a town and then you learn all about the fishing practices of the village, but it has nothing to do with what the characters are doing. And it's like, I don't care. Just tell me what's happening. Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to do when you're writing.
If you know it, great. It doesn't have to be on the page.
Yeah.
For me, it's that, but like with the food scenes, and it goes on and on about the whole banquet spread. It's like, okay. And then they end up eating a lot. Like throughout the entire story, there are so many banquets. I'm like, I got it. Okay, they're eating again. This is what they're eating. Yes, I usually end up doing that.
I have to say, I feel like I'm kind of guilty of that in some ways for books that I published years ago. An American friend was like, why are they always drinking coffee and tea? And I'm like, well, in New Zealand, if you go to someone's house, they ask for a coffee and they give you a snack. Like, it's and all these people are going to different people's houses and they're having tea and coffee or water and a snack, and because that's just you, that's what you do. It's courtesy, you know.
And
He's
that's
like, "Why are
okay.
you doing that?"
But it's the like expounding on the teapot that it's served in, and the steeping just so, and the coils of steam rising and setting. Yeah.
One of my readers, when they were
good.
reading my book, said to me, "Why is everybody always running everywhere?" There was too much running, and it's like little kids running everywhere. So I had to sort of pull back on the running.
Slow them down.
And I'm very aware now of whenever I make characters run, especially if they're adults.
That's such a good note. I didn't even think about that. I'm like going through my mind. I'm like, I definitely describe tea a lot.
It's a me thing. It's just a me thing. Many people love it. It's really just my pet peeve. It's okay.
All right. So another fun question. If you were a character in the world that you created, would you survive? And like, what would your role be if you, or I guess if you die, it doesn't matter as much, but I'm just curious.
I would be a spaceship captain.
Love that.
And I would, definitely survive.
I think I would struggle. I definitely relate to my main character in a world where like language is magic. If you do not speak anything else fluently, you probably would have a hard time, which would be me. But I think I'd make it work. I think I would probably be, I don't know. I would be a teacher again. I loved teaching. I think I would do well at that.
I think I would survive, but like in the sequel that comes out in June, I introduce a new character who's local, born and raised from Hawaii, and she's pretty annoyed at my main character from book 1 who disrespected the goddess and got them into this mess in the first place. But I had to have the character do that, otherwise there wouldn't be a story. So it's like, I'm sorry, yes, she was a fool. No, she shouldn't have done that. But so I'd probably be really similar to that annoyed character going, why didn't you just listen to your tutu? Like, just listen. Yeah.
I would like to think I survived. I'm not sure what my role would be though. It's a very small cast in my book. So I'd probably just be on the neighbor farm, really.
Just hanging out. I remember your book, it is very isolated. It's just that one family living together. So they'd be observing what's
very
going on.
Small. Just the neighbor that didn't hear the screams. That's me. Stayed out of it.
So speaking of that, if we maybe can have a moment, somebody had asked about what recommendations you have of Pacific fantasy novels, which can serve as mentor texts for world building. Ideally, they're looking for things that are outside of classic novels, especially British ones like Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter, etc. Like, is there anything that you go to, authors or texts that you might recommend?
Yeah. I really like a book called Turncoat by T. Hema Baker. It's set in the future when Earth has been colonized by aliens.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I can't make it go. It's blurring out. There we go.
Oh.
Yeah. Turncoat. And it's about a human who infiltrates the alien government and wants them to honor the founding agreement they entered into with humans. And so it's kind of a comment on the trauma that Indigenous people or Indigenous public servants feel working in a settler colonial government system. There's also, of course, Lani Went Young's Talesar series, which has kind of been called the Samoan Salmon Twilight, but it's about goddesses and Samoa. I really like that. And I also love Claire Coleman's writing. She's an Aboriginal woman. Her novel Terra Nullius is set in the future in Australia, and it's a future where Australia is also colonized by aliens. And she's also written a book called The Old Lie, which is about Earth joining an alien force to defend against another alien force. So, but I also like her. I like her writing in general, even her nonfiction. She's written a nonfiction book called Lies, Damn Lies, about the colonial experience of Aboriginal people in Australia. But yeah, everything I read seems to be about aliens colonizing the earth. Those are some books I've enjoyed.
Could check out Purako, Māori Myths Retold by Māori Writers. That was edited by Witia Hamaira and also Whiti Hiriaka. That came out a few years ago. So that's retellings of Māori myths by contemporary writers. That was pretty cool. They had some of those stories in there are phenomenal. Same as any kind of collection or anthology you get, you're going to love some of them and not going to love all of them. But yeah, there was some really amazing stories in that one. I was also going to say Turncoat. Steph Matuku, she's got a few books out which are cool. Flight of the Fantail, I really enjoyed. That was a kind of like a school trip gone wrong with aliens. So that's good times. And she's got another one coming out shortly called Migration, I think. I've just started to have a read through that. It's not out yet though, but I'm having a read of that at the moment, and that's pretty cool too. So that's again aliens are where it's at apparently. Also something a bit different. Sasha Stronach wrote the Dawn Hounds, which came out why is this fly on my camera? So weird. I wonder if it's warm. The Dawn Hounds by Sasha Stronach came out a couple of years ago through Saga Press, I think it is. Anyway, fungi and lots of Māori kind of cultural stuff in there as well. Very different, definitely not Earth at all. Very like science fiction fantasy. So that was pretty cool. Worth checking out as well. Very interesting.
I didn't read anything with aliens. I read something, but it had a magic system and a magic world that I really, really enjoyed. It's not out yet. Well, depending on when you watch this, it might be. It's coming out on the market on May 14th. It's called Clairvoyance by Christiana Kahakawila, set in Hawaii. And it's awesome. This girl wants to know what boys are thinking, and she wishes on a family heirloom, and then poof, she can hear what all the guys on the school bus and then her middle school are thinking, and it's a mess. Like nobody actually wants to hear that stuff. So she has to figure out how to navigate that new power and try to solve some issues with her ex-best friend before moving to Arizona, because she is sick and tired of where she is, and she feels lonely, and her dad lives in Arizona and has welcomed her there. But does leaving Hawaii really solve her problems?
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a good one. So keep an eye out for that. I think it'll be a great mentor text for folks looking to write that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I know it's funny when you were talking about all these alien stories. I was like, yeah, there's quite a bit of science fiction in the Pacific Islander author space. I am mostly on the fantasy side, and I was like sitting here trying to think, and I was like, I feel like there is less. Like obviously, I would recommend. I might probably say this wrong. Sorry, Makia Lucier. Love her work. Isle of Blood and Sand. Oh, I got to double check it. Isle of Blood and Stone is like a Pacific Islander fantasy. Well, actually, it's not even Pacific Islander. I'm not sure that it's explicitly stated, but I feel like she is a wonderful high fantasy writer. She has her new one, Dragonfruit, just came out. I have not read it yet, but I'm very excited. I'm waiting for my local library to get it. I think though, unfortunately, like, and then this might bring up a whole other thing, right? Because there just aren't that many people who write Pacific Islander, even fantasy and science fiction. I think we often have to look towards other sources. I find myself reading a lot of Indigenous writers. I really enjoyed To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Monoquill Blackgoose, and then Rebecca Rowan Horse's books. I particularly, yeah, she's great. I often comped her Trail of Lightning. It was a big inspiration for my own book, which is urban fantasy, and honestly, maybe the only urban fantasy I can think of by an Indigenous person. I might be wrong. I'm sure there's more, but it is difficult to find. And unfortunately, other than that, I feel like other people who've written about our area of the world tend to be white writers. Like, I can think of Where the Waters Turn Black, but I'm pretty sure that's not written by, I'm going to Google it right now. No,
Darcy Little Badger does some cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Darcy Little Badger has some good books that are. She's Lipana Apache. She's got some good books as well that are contemporary fantasy, which are good. Yeah, I think there is. I think maybe that comes back to us wanting to be respectful of our cultures and histories, and finding that a bit harder, like to where to draw the line when you're doing something pure fantasy. What you can include. I know even Rebecca Rowan Horse has had problems with this in the past, like saying, her books they're not historical, they're not just her culture. They do draw from it heavily, but then this is not representative of her culture. And it's that whole, are we only allowed to write things that are our culture? Well, people always assume that our culture is in there somewhere. Are we, because realistically we can write whatever we want to write. And I still believe our culture will always influence that and shape the way that we tell our stories or what we tell our stories about. But I think there's certainly an expectation that if you're from a culture, you should be representing that culture. It's a hard one. I sometimes think, because I'm very white, very pale, which is quite common with Kaitahu anyway, but people could just not even know. I could just pass as not being Māori. Although if you're Māori and you read my books, you'll see it in there anyway. It's just all the other people won't necessarily see it. And for a long time, I didn't feel like I could call myself a Māori writer because I didn't feel like I was enough to, like I wasn't writing the things that were expected of me or that I should be writing because I'm Māori. So I think there's a whole lot of baggage in there that has to be unpacked sometimes. Yeah,
I definitely understand that. I feel that if somebody says they are, I feel like a lot in our culture, that's kind of just how it is, right? Like we all know. I know that I don't look like what people think of. It's just, but it's not, I feel like it's almost a non-issue within the culture itself because we understand how just mixed everyone is. That's just life.
It's just colonization.
Yes, right, at work. Why is my brother blonde? I don't know. It happened. Like, and I think it's more to your point that if we are not writing these stories, other people will. Like, as much as I love like Makia and all those other authors, like she's the only person I could think of other than who is actually Pacific Islander. Where the Water Turns Black was written by, I just Googled it, Benedict Patrick, right? Not from here. I think he did fine. It's a good story, but I almost feel like you can tell reading it. I didn't know for sure until I Googled it, but I was like, I feel like it's not because there's things that you just don't know to put in because you don't know what you don't know. So, yeah. I am excited for a future where we have a lot more authors just taking up space and readers because Yeah, that's
There's
what we all
heaps
want.
of them out there coming up the ramp, but up the ranks. And I think it's our kind of help to leave space for them, to open doors for them where we can, to tell them that they can do what they're doing, and just be advocates for that, and champions. Cheer them along. There's so many amazing authors out there, and I think because there's not a lot of it, people think maybe that's not something they should be doing. Whereas actually we just need more of it. We need so much more of it. We need all of the stories.
Absolutely. And just as like a quick plug for someone else who's not here, I do know, speaking of like Pacific Islanders in space, I know that Makana Yamamoto, her book is coming out, I believe at the end of this year, Hamajang Luck. So I'm very excited to read that. Another space one. So it's like, I just thought of her. Let's throw her in. All right. So that is actually it that I have in terms of questions. Before I close, I just want to ask if there's anything anyone would like to share before we wrap up.